All right, Joel Gausten here from joelgausten.com. As you can see, I have a stacked screen of guests joining me, and I'm sure this is going to be a very unique conversation. We're going to be discussing projects that are a bit out of the norm as far as things that I typically feature on this podcast, which excites me to no end. To introduce everyone, to my top left is Santi Arribas,
Hello.
currently of the music project Rear Window. Directly below me is Mr. John Sterry, someone I've interviewed in the past. John is a former member of the band Gang of Four, as well as one half of Rear Window. And we'll certainly get into that as things move forward. And lastly, I'm delighted to be joined by Catherine Mayer. Catherine's bio is pretty extensive. I'm going to actually pull it up so I don't miss any important details. As a brief synopsis, Catherine is a best-selling author, award-winning journalist, the former Europe editor of Time magazine, the co-founder of the Women's Equality Party and Prima Donna Festival, a biographer of King Charles III, and Catherine and I first crossed paths a few years back when she was involved in a tribute project for her late husband, Andy Gill of Gang of Four, someone who comes up on this channel quite a bit. Catherine, lovely seeing you again, and welcome everyone for being here. I do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. So we have a lot to unpack here. There are individual projects you're involved in, as well as collective projects, uh, sort of a big picture of what's happening with the three of you. Initially, Catherine, you had reached out to me, I guess it was about a month or two ago, letting me know you were on the finish line of releasing your debut fiction novel called Time Life, and wanted to see if I would like to read it. And you're also involved with Santi and John in the audio components of that book, which we'll get to in a moment. And I read the book, finished it this morning in anticipation of this conversation. And I have to preempt this entire discussion to reveal that I feel a bit out of sorts going into this particular recording because I'm still recovering from reading the book and finishing the book. Um, I can say with a full heart, it's unlike anything I've ever read in my lifetime. It's deeply moving, beautiful, powerful, and this is what it did to me.
Sorry.
I'm miscabobulated in the best way possible. It's really yeah, it hit me. And I finished it, stared at the screen, knowing we would be doing this, and thinking, how do I unpack this in this conversation? Um, so first of all, let me just say from one writer to another, my compliments. It's first of all, it's exquisitely written. I wanted to say that. And my immediate, completely still sort of jarred from the experience perspective is it's a very interesting bunch of books. One, um, it's for the viewer who has no idea what I'm talking about. Time Life is, I guess we could say, predominantly a science fiction novel. I think it also serves as a commentary on uh, society, particularly media, and what the world of journalism, which is my world as well, what that world has become. God only knows in 2025 what it even is now. Um, and it's also a love story over and above that. And there's a lot to take in, a lot to process. Um, so before I get into even a single question about it, just congratulations to you for creating this thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's an amazing description of it. It's so strange. I mean, this is the same with music, and I think anything that any of us create or put out there, pieces, whatever, they don't you don't put them out knowing how anyone's going to respond to them. You have literally no idea. And so feedback like that both means the world and is, funnily enough, quite discombobulating for me as well. Because I lived that book when I was writing it. You know, there was no gap between me and what I was writing, and the worlds that I built in it became as real to me as the day, but I didn't know, you know, as my everyday, but I didn't know whether it would have that effect on people. And gradually I'm gathering that it really does.
Yeah, absolutely. I read it through a journo's eyes first and foremost because that's what I do. So there are a lot of things in there that I found instantly relatable. The waking up in the hotel and not knowing anything and where you are, and what city is this? Who am I? What am I doing here? We've all had those moments, falling asleep inadvertently in front of a computer screen in some faraway city somewhere. So from that minor point that made me chuckle to your discussions on the character in the book, who we should say is a fictional narrator. The book is presented as a memoir of a fictional journalist named Dory Silver. Dory, to kind of give a brief synopsis to the viewer, Dory's a journalist, and she is tasked with being involved in an event with a tech bro, who we all know what that means in 2025. A tech bro who has come up with time travel, apparently, allegedly, a time machine. And long story short, Dory and said tech bro get transported into the future. So it's very H.G. Wells' time machine. Um, uh, Coinciding with that, Dory's partner is dealing with a major health issue. So there's that going on, and there's the concept of time and mortality, and if we do harness this power of time travel, would we really want to use it? And what does it mean to have that responsibility? So there's a lot of moving parts to this, and one of the great risks I have whenever I speak to an author is how much of the story do I give away? Because
Mm.
ultimately, I want people to get this book. So get this book and read it, please, people. Having said that, there is that obvious straight line between what you've created and H.G. Wells, The Time Machine. It's sort of a repurposing. I think that's probably the best way to describe that part of the narrative. So for you, well, first of all, um, what is it about Wells' work that it spoke to you most, and why go in the direction of using that as the foundation for what later became your novel?
I've been obsessed with H.G. Wells, but also speculative fiction or science fiction or whatever you want to call it for most of my life. And I both love H.G. Wells and he drives me nuts because quite apart from anything else, there are no women in his stories, or those women that there are, for example, in The Time Machine. There's the housekeeper who is known as the housekeeper who walks, whose main function is to walk backwards, so you know which direction in time they're traveling. And also this future creature called Weena, who is, as the name suggests, very um, easily frightened and is less than the any of the male protagonists. So but his ideas, he is such a brilliant writer, but he was also a brilliant predictor of the future. A lot of what's in Wells has come true. And I think, part of why I turned to fiction when I did, I actually wrote most of this in 2019. And I accidentally managed to predict the future as well, because, my tech titan is called Elo Halvoran. He buys a social media platform. I wrote that in 2019. I came up with a device of having a pandemic in 2019 because I needed to have my characters be put in quarantine when they arrived in the future. And that, so I stumbled on the future before it happened. I think there is I some of that is coincidence, but some of it is why I love H.G. Wells and science fiction so much, which is and why I felt it might do a better job than journalism, particularly the debased form of journalism that we're all living with now, is because if you look really closely at your own world and extrapolate from it what might happen in the future, you sometimes get to truths better than if you're following the rules of reporting that don't work so well in a world where everybody lies and nobody knows what the truth is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the 2019 element to this because when I was reading the book, I thought, wow, Catherine's doing a stellar job of representing current events, and my initial thought was, oh, you've written this within the last year or two, obviously. And then I had learned this had actually started on the bus during a Gang of Four tour in 2019. And I was absolutely stunned that so we're talking a book about time travel, and you kind of traveled in time. So obviously, the finish line for the book was much further along than 2019, and obviously, you experienced things in your personal life that inform some of the elements of the book as well.
But
But
also, that's also why I didn't finish. I mean, when Andy died, which was of course in 2020, it was so close to part of the plot line that was already there that I couldn't bear the idea of looking at the book and I put it away. And I'm not even sure I would have gone back to it if Elon Musk hadn't have bought Twitter, because that's the moment that I went back to. I just went, oh my God, that's in the book. And some other things had already come true. But I wasn't sure. I sort of thought I might be fooling myself. So I went back to have a look. And that's when I decided to finish it. But I'd written 50,000 words of a novel that's about 75,000 words. So it was mostly written by then.
and as I said before, the novel attempts to achieve many things and does achieve many things. It's almost like three different books in one, where the time travel element could have been its own standalone book, I feel. The thoughts on the journalist side of it and Dory's character could have served that as well. And also the underlying love story could have served thirdly as a separate entity, I find. So it's very ambitious, A, to put all these elements together into one book and have it work as well as it does. It's really admirable and impressive how these things do weave together the way that you've done it. Did you initially have this idea of having these sort of seemingly disparate elements combined the way you did, or was it something that sort of came together as, you're working on one element and then this other sort of side door opened and that led to the next part?
No, I think one of the reasons I find this novel so exposing, even as somebody who's written a memoir and as well as, other non-fiction, but you'd have thought a memoir, particularly as it was a grief memoir, would be the most intimate thing you could write. But I think the reason it's very scary for me going out with this book is that it's the first and possibly last time I've ever let anybody see what the inside of my brain looks like. That's that's how I think, but and as a journalist, as you know, a lot of the job is to kind of have all these different strands, but then boil them back down again in order to make them comprehensible and to tell a story well. But for me, that's also part of the problem with journalism now is oversimplification and I'll move away from complexity. So I very deliberately let myself I gave myself permission to be complicated with the interweaving. But that's also I wasn't sure. I was really hoping people could follow the story, and they can, and I know they can. And the funny thing is, I don't want to give away spoilers, but one of the things that keeps happening to me is people keep getting in touch and wanting me to do a sequel
Mm.
or wanting me to sort of pick up pick up towards the end there, which I'm not, by the way, intending to do, but it's an interesting thing, because there are these different strands, and
Yeah.
They want to know what happens next. They also want to know what happens next in case I've predicted something else that awful.
Yeah, yeah, true. Yeah, it's sort of like you're looking at the book a bit sideways now. Like, do I dare write more? Uh,
Yeah.
let me take a long walk to a question. In that, as I've stated in other editions of this podcast, as far as the music journalist side of what I do, there's no other band I've written about more in my career than Gang of Four in various iterations of the group. So I'm quite familiar with the narrative at this point. As I'm reading your book, it was difficult for me not to spot certain threads and um, certain topics that were approached in the book. And
Well,
I
Mayer 4 is in the book, we should say.
yeah,
It's
yeah, there's a lot of
they're
references.
real people
Yeah,
and real people and invented people. It's auto fiction in that sense.
right,
Dory isn't me and Morgan is not Andy, but there are
right.
similarities.
Right. And again, not wanting to give away much of the story here, but also trying to work a way into something I'm fascinated about in that, yes, there is that separation, certainly. Um, my initial thought early in the book is, oh, well, Morgan's certainly Andy, you know. But then Andy comes up by name elsewhere, and I'm like, oh, okay, so it's a little bit different. But there are certainly narrative doors that were open that, for those familiar with the history of the band and certainly Andy's history to go, oh, okay, I see where this fits in. So by taking the approach you did in kind of separating, creating sort of parallel characters alongside the real world characters. Did how did that help you or change your approach to addressing what are very real world events and real world issues that ultimately did make it into the book, just not as clearly stated as they may have been otherwise?
Um, I think I thought it was the lovely thing about it being fiction that again you can get to truths without being burdened by the ways in which we get to truths as journalists, and sometimes these days fail to do so. So I mean, it's also the book's a bit of of a love letter to science fiction, but it's also a love letter to music. You know, there are a lot of music references in there. And of course, I love music. I just hate the music industry. So there's some side swipes at the music industry in there. Um, I love these other guys on the screen here. There are people in the music industry who mean the world to me, but that but all the industry around creative output, publishing isn't quite as problematic, but there are lots of things that actually sometimes can get in the way, or are part of a wider culture. So it was so much easier to tell stories about them when I had characters who could do the things I wanted them to do to show those things, because it's show, not tell. Journalism is all us telling people what they're seeing. This is letting people reach their own
Right,
conclusions.
right, right. And I should mention the book is published on an indie press, not one of the big five, as we would say, in the US. And I have to think that benefited the book, if to opine for a minute, because as I'm looking at this thing as it unfolds and the structure you chose, frankly, I can't think of a major publisher running with it because I mean it's ultimately successful, right? But I could imagine an editor who has their parameters they must think within looking at this and going, there's no way this has to be three separate books. So going the route you ultimately took, looking more for an indie publisher direction, would you agree that there were, perhaps benefits to the narrative goals you had for the book as well as just the, working
Yeah.
with somebody who understood what you were trying to say?
That's directly the case because I actually have a deal with one of the big publishers, and indeed the book is out on audiobook with HarperCollins.
Hmm.
Um, so because lots of the indies don't do audiobooks yet, and I love audiobooks. I mean, this is again, this all relates to Andy and Gang of Four because his studio, we're now making audiobooks as well as music in his studio. But I've always ever since that the option of audiobooks came up, I always felt that they should be able to do more and more and more than they're actually doing. And Santi works with me on that side of things as well. Um, so, but you're absolutely right that I, HarperCollins has first option on things that I do, but I went to them and I said, look, I've written this, but I don't think you're going to want to publish this. And so we came up with um, this arrangement, which um, it's been Renard Press is an amazing press, and it's also the guy who set it up, Will Daly. He set it up in basically in lockdown, and has already published a ton of books, but also won a ton of awards. And the awards that he's won also speak to the subject matter of the book because he is doing as close as is possible to do climate positive publishing, inclusive publishing, all the kind of value sets that I'm again trying to show rather than than telling, letting people reach their own conclusions on. But it's very nice to work that way on something. So yes, it was I guess again in music, certainly some of the projects that Andy and John and Santi have all done have have been doing things where there is more freedom because of doing them with again sort of different models than the big old majors and all the restrictions that come with those.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Speaking of the audiobook and audio in general, thanks for hanging in there, guys. Appreciate it. And wanted to bring you both in because you play into the greater picture of this project as well, in that John and Santi, you have a project you're working on in the current tense, Rear Window, and you contribute a song called Rocket Man to the audiobook version of the novel. So I want to kind of rewind a bit and talk about how you both individually sort of came into the bigger picture. John, obviously, you fronted Gang of Four in the later years when Andy was leading things, we'll say, prior to his passing. Um, and Santi, you were working with Andy in the studio at that time as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, for about a decade.
Okay.
Mhm.
So in what capacity were because I know you worked in his studio and I'd imagine it's a very busy place in those days.
Um, what capacity? Probably everything. Um, no, I was just engineering for him, helping with the production. We worked together in several projects, and mostly whenever he had a production job, I would come in and help him with it's part of the process of making records. We even ended up in China once for almost a month, making an album there with a Chinese band, and then obviously there was quite a lot of work, Gang of Four related, of course, the last few albums, and on the road as well. I did some front of house sound um, with the band earlier on until touring became a bit of a toll for me. I prefer to stay in the studio rather than trotting around. Uh, yeah, John and I met um, when he joined the band, and we were basically doing shows mostly, and then we started doing some recordings afterwards.
Mm.
if I remember well.
Yeah. But yeah, I think we'd sort of like we'd skirted around it really. We'd done a couple of Santi's had a project called Roadside Bandits that I did a couple of tracks
Yes.
on, doing some top line and some lyric help on those projects, and those two albums that Santi did. And then yeah, then we just sort of I don't even really remember a conversation about how this whole thing started.
Well,
We just kind of
we
we wrote a couple of songs maybe with the idea of doing an EP, and then before we knew it, we had more than an EP, and we were like, well, we're closer to an album than an EP now, so we might as well we might as well do an album, and it just kind of
it was quite funny. We because we finished a song for one of my, as John said, my project, which is called the Roadside Bandits project, which is very politically charged content on the lyrics, and it's my futile attempt to join blues, which is my first love in music and electronic music. But it's fun. It's a fun job to do, and I've always loved John's voice and his way of writing. So we did a song for the first album. The second album, we did another one. When we finished it, we should sit down and write some songs. Yeah, all right. Yeah. And we did. We started throwing ideas at each other, and we wrote a song, two, three, four, and then with 12 somehow. I don't know. We just, I mean, I hate using the word, but very organically, the whole thing happened over what, a year and a half, John? Was it that long?
yeah, about that, yeah. And it was just a different way of writing to how I suppose we're both kind of used to, really. Like Santi would quite often come up with the seed of the idea, and we sort of played to our strengths a little bit, really. Like I'd go away with that idea and do a top line and a lyric over the top. We come back, and then we'd go into the studio and we'd shape it that way. And it just felt like, I'm not going to use the word organically. I just did, actually.
We
But
both did.
it's very natural in the way that we kind of like just started writing together. Really, it didn't feel that forced at all, and I think we were doing it well totally for the enjoyment of just crafting songs, and the fact that it turned into an album is became a
Yeah,
bonus.
we sat down to write music with the idea of we just wrote anything we want at it, rather than being genre specific on anything. Um, we happen to have very similar taste in music, though we do individually very, very different things. Um, um, and one of uh, the odd things that we did is we wrote a song, we produced it, we mixed it, we finished it, and then we moved into the next one, rather than just writing a bunch of songs and then revising them and then mixing
Mm.
them all together. And we actually literally went one at a time, which could be a bit dangerous and lose a little bit of track of what you're doing, but diverted too much musically speaking. But no, I think we managed to keep a constant somewhere there.
Mm-hmm. And the songs that we've done have never been the kind of music that Santi and I do separately, like as Roadside Bandits and as JJ Sterry. Like they're very, very different to each other, but also to the Rear Window stuff. So they never felt like there was any kind of crossover in what we were really doing. So it just felt like those songs we were writing were very clearly for that project, and it didn't feel it didn't feel like there's any confusion there. Even though it skips between genres quite a lot, that album. I think there's a common thread.
Excellent. And the album we should mention is called Happiness by Design. The project again is called Rear Window. Now that the album's out and there's, obviously the tie-in with the song Rocket Man with the novel, where do you see things going in the not too distant future, in terms of is this currently a live performing entity as well, or is it strictly a studio?
It's a studio project. We never thought of uh, going out and playing this live,
Mhm.
unless we always say, well, unless there is a by popular demand who wants us to do it. But we that was never idea. I certainly feel much more comfortable in the studio than live. It's my element. And in terms of what we're going to do, we're just gonna take it as it goes along. We might end up writing some more songs soon. I don't know. At the moment, John is busy with his EP that is just coming out soon. September, is it, John? Can't remember.
Yeah, it's gonna be September. But
And
it feels like we just need to take a little bit of breath because it was quite. Although the album was sort of done over the course of a year and a half. Did you say something? Probably
I
about
think
that.
it's a year and a half by the time we
Yeah,
finished it. Yeah, yeah,
it felt quite intense, and I think it's just we'll probably just take a bit of stock, let the album breathe a little bit once it's out there now, and I'm sure 100% we're going to be writing some more songs together, which would be
yeah. And
always fun.
I'm probably going to throw an EP out as well with the Roadside Bandits project, because I feel like doing a bit of blues.
Mm.
Why not? But yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see. It just came out. I mean, it came out a month and a
Yeah,
half ago.
literally. Yeah.
So
But I feel like, the way Time Life was sort of weirdly ahead of the curve. I feel like lots of the tracks on Happiness by Design echo stuff that's going on. I
Mm.
think, by the way, it's intensely syncable. If I was in a newsroom, I'd be putting a lot of those tracks. Well, I did. I mean, when I'm on Instagram, I keep using Happiness by Design because it fits so many of the phenomena that we're seeing in the world at the moment.
Mm.
And I mean, Rocket Men very obviously, because we wrote that about those men competing to send their big rockets up, and about political power and all of that. But multicolored skies. I put on a track the other day just because it fits so perfectly. I don't know. I think you're tapped into some, sorry, this is a worse word than organic. You're tapped into a zeitgeist.
wow.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree. I mean, it wasn't as if there was a discussion as to what like the kind of themes were going to be that we were going to touch upon, but yeah, it sort of always kept coming back to that idea, which is like perfectly summed up, I think, in the album title, "Happiness by Design." It's like everybody's kind of looking within themselves to try and sort of like question: Are they happy? Are they fulfilled? And that can kind of you can extrapolate that like throughout the things that they do, the actions that they take, and that can be as small as like someone's life, or it can be something huge like people going to the moon and stuff. Um, so yeah, it feels like I don't know. That feels kind of how the world's going. It's becoming quite introspective, which is interesting to me as a writer.
And from the production perspective, there are elements that of a very modern, some are very vintage, if you want to use that word. Um, but that again was part of the, you know, let's make something that makes us happy, and obviously we both had a strong influence by Andy Gill's way of making music because we both worked with him for a decade, um, over a decade, and there's a little bit of Gang 4 in there at times, um, but uh, we did a cover of an Elvis song, we made it very different to the original, but Suspicious Minds, but even that sort of vintage touch to it was part of the let's just add anything that we feel like, why not?
Mm.
And then when it came to Rocket Men, that Catherine had this idea of, well, you guys want to put one of your songs in the audiobook, and so we said, yeah, okay, give us some ideas what you want to do, and Catherine came back with a bunch of bits of text titled each one of them. And for some reason, John and I were like, oh, Rocket Man, that one. We like that one. And we took those, well, rather John took those lyrics and wrote a lyric, um, adding the more poetic element to it. And then we just did it the normal way we do the song. But that's
There's that bit where I said to you, we want a little bit more Andy in here, and you put that brilliant
yeah.
guitar noise in there.
I
Um,
I, I dared to
but
use a fuzz effect on the song. That sounded a bit like a solo, and they would throw it on my head. Um, putting a guitar solo in it. Yeah, yeah. There's that's one of the songs that has some of the more Gang of Four-ish kind of angular guitar sounds.
but
Right.
also the name of the band, I should say, you calling yourselves Rear Window,
Mm.
that is that is Andy DNA. And it comes from a joke a very long time ago, because when Andy and I were first living together, we weren't living here where I'm speaking to you, where Andy's studio is. We were living down by Tower Bridge on the river in this really nice flat that would have been a really nice flat, except that Andy commandeered the living room and turned it into his kind of recording studio. It had no soundproofing. I mean, I feel so guilty in retrospect about our neighbors, because Andy was always in there doing stuff, and it had the best view in the whole flat. But among the views, you could see a bit of Tower Bridge, but you could also see right into the flats on either side. And there were some exhibitionists living in the flats who had sex in front of the windows. And so I would come home and find people kind of staring out the window. But also, one day I came home and Andy was convinced that the plot of Rear Window, the Hitchcock, was unfolding. Um, that basically somebody had murdered his wife and he hadn't seen her and whatever. Um, I can't remember. I now can't remember the plot of the film, but Andy was convinced that was happening. So when he was doing some album at that point, and he put on the album recorded at Rear Window Studios.
Mm.
And then when we moved here, the studio, which is a proper purpose-built, beautiful recording studio, is subterranean. It has no windows, but he still called it Rear Window. And so we still call it Rear Window Studios, and the band but Rear Window is obviously a great name for a band that is looking into the soul in the way that John described.
Mm.
Yeah, we skirted around quite a lot of names and just
Yeah.
kept coming back to Rear Window. It kind of it's perfect. I love it. And it is one of my favorite, definitely one of my favorite Hitchcock films for sure. Yeah, it's great.
Does he murder his wife? Have I misremembered that?
No,
Uh,
he's oh, the man across the road. Oh, I can't remember.
Yeah.
Oh,
We all need to go watch
I
Rear
haven't seen
Window.
it in a long time. I haven't seen it in a long
Yeah,
time.
the answer will show up in the comments to the video because I'm drawing a blank myself, but let us know, viewer, what's the plot? Because we've all lost it apparently.
long time ago.
But for me, being a fan of obviously Gang of Four, and a fan of the current activities that the three of you have done together, I think it's wonderful that the connections that started with Andy continue to this day. Certainly when someone um, of his relevance passes, you think, oh, that's clearly the end of something, obviously. But it's when Catherine, when you told me about what was going on a few months back, I went, oh wow, because I was excited to hear the song because firstly, John, I've been a fan of your work, in Gang of Four, post Gang of Four, and I know I said this to you the last time we spoke that. Um, Gang of Four, I've never held anything back when I've written about them because I love the band so much. I feel like I'd be cheating the band if I didn't say what I felt about it. And, everything I've written is a matter of public record. I was among the skeptical when Andy brought the incarnation of the group out that you were fronting. But man, the last time I saw you live, won me over. I think the band was really reaching for some very interesting things that met and often exceeded the foundation of the initial group. So the fan in me was heartbroken in the events of 2020. So I love the fact that there's new material that we can talk about, and there is forward motion individually and collectively. Those connections didn't go away, post 2020. So, a totally unsolicited statement on the topic, but I wanted to share that because, it's nice to see there's forward motion done in a way that you've done it. With, not only with the novel, but the music and this project. Going back to the audiobook, Santi, I know that you recorded the audiobook, correct?
Correct.
Have you started a support group yet? Because you had to live with this stuff so intimately, and I can't get through it. My mind is still wobbly from finishing it. So, for you having to be so connected to this material in the extent that you did, tell me a bit about the process of capturing the essence of the novel, in spoken form and your participation in that.
Well, mm, uh, well, we do a lot of work with HarperCollins in the studio, very regularly. Um, so we had a few options for narrators, and we but ultimately Catherine took the decision, obviously, what she preferred, and ended up with Annie Eldington, who's a great, fantastic narrator, um, who was a breeze to work with. So it was the audiobook. It had a few bits there slightly uh, abnormal in terms of how you format things, but because of the nature of the book. But we treated it like like any other audiobook. But when it came to add music to it, the original idea was to put a song at the end of it, which was Rocket Man. Um, but I had this idea of, okay, why don't we grab um, elements from the song and add them as an opening of every chapter. So every now and then you will get a synthesizer or a guitar sound, or even a drum loop. So at the beginning of every chapter, you'll have some element from the song. The interesting thing is, and I haven't mentioned this to anyone before, it actually follows in order of the song. So from chapter one to the last chapter, every element that you're hearing correspond more or less to the time in the song. So you would need to put all those parts together and compile them together in time and compress them, and you will hear the song, basically, with the exception of the vocals, of course. I just use sounds. And and that was basically how I thought would be a good way of adding a musical element without being too overbearing. Audiobook listeners like to listen to the spoken word rather than music, obviously. Otherwise, they'll buy a record, not an audiobook. And then we put a song at the end of the book. Um,
Well, that's the thing. You can put bonuses on audiobooks. So
yes,
there's a conversation between me and just to confuse
sorry, yes,
names,
that too.
Sandy Toksvig. One of my closest friends is very well known over here as a woman called Sandy Toksvig, and Sandy and Santi are next to each other in my email and my phone book with some dangerous results. But anyway, we recorded a conversation about the book as well. But that's, I mean, it's funny, Santi, you saying that audiobook listeners don't want music, because my feeling is that this is a very different book, for example, to Barbara Streisand's autobiography, but there are some books that get away with having shed loads of music in them.
Yeah,
And
no, I meant, sorry, I meant music while the speech is
no, no,
happening.
no. I know what you meant, but I would love to do a sort of deluxe version of this audiobook that actually, because there are all the other music references in there, I'd kind of love to do one that has more of a soundscape going on. Not that we're playing the songs as what they're mentioned or whatever, but I think it would be really fun to do that. But I won't do that to you, don't worry.
Thank you.
But I think audiobooks, I like, the more audiobooks develop, the more you can do that. And there is some convergence with music projects that, you know, they can.
Yes, there's a lot more now than used to be, particularly for kids. Books for kids have a lot of music in them. It's quite norm these days. And I've written several theme music for books. And so there's a series of 4 or 5 books, for example, where the music will appear in each one of them, and it's kind of like a common thing to them. Yeah, but it makes them certainly more interesting, I think.
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities that can go into this moving forward.
Mm.
I'm reminded when I was reading the book, I was reminded because I knew how the book was affecting me. And I would have a terrible time sort of unpacking all those thoughts in this conversation. And God knows it'd be difficult for me to review the book in written word because it's like that tidal wave that hit. And maybe in a year's time, Catherine, we'll do the proper interview about the book after I've sort of sorted it all out. Um, but sort of preamble question I have for you. I remember back in maybe 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer. I was interviewing Andy, and I was asking him specifically about the song "The Dying Rays."
Mm.
In my opinion, is one of his greatest moments as a creative force. You
Yeah.
know, I thought he was reaching something that few people do, creatively speaking and lyrically speaking, and maybe hearing it as an older person versus the teenager who listened to entertainment, it hit me a certain way, of course. But so it was kind of like, tell me about that one, Andy. Where were you coming from with that? And he said something quite profound that I always keep in mind when I have these conversations, particularly with authors. And he made the comment that creative people sometimes run the risk of being their own reviewers in interviews and saying a bit too much about where they're coming from with things. And, the magic can be lost to some degree. Having said that, I'm hoping I can ask this question in that, what would you ideally, if you had your wish, and we don't always have our wish when we create something and put it out in the world, it's not ours anymore. We don't have ownership of it anymore. It's the recipient's ownership at that point. But what would you hope would be the ultimate takeaway from the
Mm.
novel? What would you like people to feel once the book is completed?
Well, in a sense, that is a difficult question, but only because I want them to feel several things. I want them to be bound up enough in the characters that they are very moved by it. I mean, it's for me, I actually would laugh and cry when I was writing. That's how deeply into it I was. I make myself laugh all the time, but I was also sort of sobbing at various times. And the I mean, I felt that as I think I said before, that fiction could maybe do a better job of trying to describe not just the future, but why we are in this terrible state in the world we're in now. I wanted to explain the intersections of populism and technology. And that's the bit that is most prescient in a sense, because I understood that the Elon Musks of the world and but also their output were entirely opening the door to the kind of populism that you're seeing not just in America, sadly, but everywhere with all these disastrous effects. And also, it opens the door to manipulation by bad faith actors around the world, obvious ones. And yet, we are also in a world where people see the problems created by technology and try and answer it with more technology. We're in a world in which, again, I think I said something like this before, but for me, it's one of the most profound problems is that people believe everything and nothing. People are simultaneous, and AI has come on and made that even more the case, that people literally don't know whether what they're looking at is real or not. And it means that they are both, it should make people in some ways more suspicious, but what it does is it sort of makes people suspect real stuff, but then fall for pretty obvious deep fakery and whatever. And so I want people to understand, I think, um, certain fundamental things. I want people to hold on to the things that matter. And the things that matter is that we should rely on our own perceptions more, um, and insist on that kind of rigor that has completely gone out the window with our profession. Um, but also that love and joy and those things still matter even in the darkest of times. Um, Again, I mean, I was at this really great party on Thursday night. It's the Women's Prize, which is big literary prize over here, the Women's Prize for fiction and for non-fiction. But it was also their 30th anniversary. And so there was this sort of rather wonderful party. But a lot of us were at the party kind of like, we're having this really good time and the world is burning. What is this dissociative experience we're having here? And I was kind of saying, well, I used to not understand how it was that people would still go out and have a good time when there may, party as if there was no tomorrow, when there might not be a tomorrow. Well, now I understand it. And I not only understand it, but I sort of want to encourage it. I want us all to still love and have joy and do all of those things, but also be active, So there is a bit of a call to arms hidden in the book because you know, I don't believe in sitting by and watching these people destroy the world.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I think I just splurged there, but
No, no, it absolutely does make sense. I was actually going through some older posts of mine on social media this week, actually. Came across one from February 2020, oddly enough. And we thought the world was on fire then, but they're talking about, this is, Trump is running for re-election and, there's all this going on and there's little tiny hints of a possible pandemic, some weird illness is happening overseas. And I remember writing, going and having a lovely lunch with someone at a park is as much a political act these days as going to a rally. We have to remember, you know, we have to live our lives. It can't all be extremity 24/7. Switch the technology off for at least some time of the day and go for a walk. The simple things, I tell people sometimes, being in the music world, I don't think it's a great stretch to say there's a lot of politically minded people in that world, and I have to suggest to some friends, like, hey, instead of posting that 50th Trump meme today, why don't you call five of your friends and get together and do something, or at least check in on them, you know? So for every meme, call five of your friends or do something like this to at least sort of balance out, you know? Yeah, the world is on fire, but the world's always been on fire in some degree, you know? And I think people need to perhaps realize that a bit more. And I think it's the role of journalists to help push that philosophy. And sadly, as you know, so few are.
yeah.
So few are pushing the agenda of everything being the end of the world. That's an entirely different conversation that we could have as to why they're doing that. But um, I think
Well,
more,
they're help. I mean, I guess another takeaway from the book is it goes to something you said about that 500th Trump meme that you're posting. People who are doing that are actually helping Trump because they're spreading the more polarized the online world gets, the more these messages are spread, the more it's helping populism. So the other thing is that we need to find new ways of resistance. And for me, that's also why I wrote the novel too. Even that I've been writing about the rise of the far right for a long time as a journalist, so that was already in my mind. And I knew what I did know what was coming in that sense. And I think that by we resist through joy as well as through
yeah,
more standard forms of resistance, but we also resist through the things that we create and through storytelling, whether it's musical storytelling or books or other forms.
yeah, absolutely. And there were so many points when I was reading the book, I had to stop and think, yes, Yes, Catherine, or yes, Dory. You're making it. You're saying it. You're making the point. Finally, somebody's saying these things, and that could be your examination of the world of journalism. My generation was the very last that came up studying newspapers in school. So 25 years into my career, I'm a bit fossilized, because there's so many things that have changed technologically based, and I don't think for the better. And I don't think that's just my middle-aged perspective talking. I think that's just, being a student of history, realizing that we're in a very dangerous place, uh, meaning members of the journalism community. I see a very definitive line in the sand being drawn here, between right and wrong. And it's a confusing and frustrating place. Even the conversation of what is journalism in 2025, it's frightening. If you're lucky to find a job in 2025 as a journalist, what does that mean? What exactly are you doing? Are you serving the role that we grew up believing existed, or is it something else entirely? You know, are you representing an agenda based on what your channel happens to be that you're working for? Or are you doing your proper job? Very gray areas these days. So, as you're sort of untangling these things, I'm thinking, yes, yes, finally somebody is saying these things. So I love that bit. But as you said, I think your statement is beautiful because that's what I took away from the book, amongst many other things. And as I said, I think if I hadn't finished it today, I would have come in with a very well prepared and structured discussion point list for you. But I'd rather we did it this way because this is the most honest reaction I can share with you. It just blew me away. And as I said, it's unlike anything I've experienced as not only a reader of books, but as a fellow writer. I think the techniques you employed are fascinating and knocked me out, knocked me out. And it'll take me some time to get my head around everything I just took in. And I thank you for that, because if it was pap, this would be a very difficult interview to get through.
If it were Pap, I mean, this is a funny thing to say, but given your feelings about Gang of Four and Andy, I don't think Andy and I would have been together for all those years if I was the sort of person who produced Pap. I mean, it, I I think all of the rest of us on this screen can hear his voice all the time. I mean, how many times, John and Santi, do you like hear Andy like just taking the piss out of you at any given moment? Uh, it's like having somebody over here who is a very funny but quite stern taskmaster sometimes and just calls you out when you if you're anywhere going anywhere near Pap. It's like, no, back off.
Yeah, I agree for sure. He's definitely if it's a 50-50 decision between veering towards Pap, Andy's voice definitely comes into my head sometimes.
Yeah.
Not that politely.
It's crap.
It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, much less polite than anything I just said.
Well, I mean that was always one of the takeaways from Andy's work, whether it be with the initial Gang of Four or the later years. It wasn't always easily and readily palatable stuff. It took some time to sort of unbox certain things and build a relationship with the work to understand it. And that was always one of the greatest joys I had with Andy's work, is it wasn't a straight shot. Like I said to Hugo Burnham once, Gang of Four was never a baby I love you band. There were other things at play there. And that was always the great thing about Andy's work that I always took away. Um, which just reminded me of something that I would love to bring up with you. Here's a clear example of something like that has grown with me over the years. Unburdened off of shrink wrap,
Oh God.
which is 30 years anniversary wise this year, and one of my favorite Gang of Four records. Um, but I bring that up because
I'm
later
on.
later I realized the name on the credit.
Yeah.
You are the phone sex
Sex
operative
worker.
with that track.
I'm
Yeah.
a sex worker. Yeah, I know. Well, there's a really funny story behind that as well, which is that actually Andy didn't want me to do the vocal. He wanted Louise Goffin to do the vocal. And he rang her up and he said, Louise, I've got this great idea for a song. And then he explained like that it was about alienation and somebody calling one of those old-fashioned sex telephone lines and whatever. And there was a long pause, and then she said, Andy, I don't think I'm quite in that place right now. Um, and I didn't know any of this. And then he rang me up. I was at work in the middle of a newsroom. I was at that stage a deputy editor on something, and I was sitting in the traditional glass box, but with one other person. And he rang me up and he went, I need you to I need you to do this vocal. And he sent me the vocal over, and I was going like, I'm in a glass box with somebody in a room full of journalists, and you want me to I'm taking my dress off. And also he was annoyed because I am originally American, but my accent's gone. And he kept shouting, not shouting, but he kept saying, you need to be more American. And I was just mortified by the whole thing, but also found it incredibly funny. That was so Andy. So that whole lyric, that whole vocal is recorded with me sitting in a glass box with a ton of journalists innocently sitting outside it. Then I forget about it. I don't think about it anymore. Many years later, I'm at Time magazine, and by this stage the editor there in for Europe and for the European issues, and I'm sitting there leading a an editorial meeting, and I notice people giggling, and I asked them why, what they're laughing at, and it turns out that one of them has stumbled across Unburden, and they think it's the funniest thing ever that their older female editor is actually the sex worker on this Gang of Four song. So, but if you look hard enough, you'll also find, as I said to them, you'll also find a video where I'm naked in a bathtub. So, again, I was in the bath and he just came in with his camera.
I remember the first time I heard that song. I was already deep in the Gang of Four. Songs of the Free is my favorite album, by the way, and I Will Be a Good Boy is one of my favorite songs. So I always had a little bit more of an affinity for the songs that Andy would sing. So I'm listening to Shrink Wrap, which I hadn't had any familiarity with. I just saw it on the rack at the store. I went, "Oh, new Gang of Four. I'm gonna buy this and play it." So I'm getting into it, and then I hear I'm here, right here, and I'm like, "Uh-oh, another get Andy Gill, depths of the human soul exploration is about to come." And I was right. But yeah, classic, absolute classic. Um, well, again, I congratulate all three of you on, not only your individual projects, but the combined work you've done with respect to Time Life. Catherine, thank you again for allowing me the advanced read and to experience what this was. Again, very deep and moving experience for me, as I knew it would be. I didn't know to the degree at which it would affect me, but it certainly has. So thank you for that experience, and thank you for putting this work into the world. John and Santi, thank you for the great music as well that accompanies it, and of course the project Rear Window. As I said, I will include a variety of links in the video description that'll point people to the proper directions. And John, it's great seeing you again, man. I'm really happy that you're forward moving with things creatively. I became a great fan of your stuff with Gang of Four. I listen to those albums quite rare, quite frequently to this day. Get a lot out of them, and just really excited to see things are moving forward. And certainly, all of you, my door is always open, whether it's in written form or keep me posted on where things go moving ahead. I'd love to have you guys back, and we'll do something similar again.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel.
My pleasure. Until we talk again, take care.